At this very moment, something unusual is happening behind NASA's closed doors. Launch schedules have shifted. Satellite arrays once focused on deep space surveys are now locked onto a single target. And somewhere within the agency's classified communication channels, a phrase has begun to repeat: Protocol Umbra, Level 2. Nothing about this makes sense. 3I Atlas, the interstellar object once labelled harmless, hasn't changed course, hasn't emitted a single burst of radiation, and yet the world's most advanced space agency is mobilising as if a threat has entered orbit. Officially, there's no danger. Unofficially, something has them worried enough to reactivate systems designed for planetary defence. The question is simple: what did they see? And if you're enjoying this journey into the universe's strangest mysteries, hit that like button and subscribe to join us as we explore the science behind what might be humanity's first interstellar warning. Also, tell us where you're watching from and what time you started this video, because timing, as you're about to see, matters more than ever. When the first anomaly appeared, it didn't come from 3I Atlas itself, it came from Earth. An observatory in the Mojave Desert detected a pulse in the ionosphere, a faint rhythmic tremor, unlike anything caused by solar activity. The signal repeated 3 times, each interval lasting exactly 29 hours. To most scientists it was noise, but to those who'd been tracking 3I Atlas since its discovery, the timing was impossible to ignore. The pulse matched the object's internal rotation period down to the millisecond. For months that rotation had been consistent, slow, steady, predictable, until now. The new readings showed a subtle change. The object was accelerating, as if something inside had begun to wake up. NASA's official response was measured, almost too calm. Routine magnetic interference, they called it. But leaked fragments of telemetry data told a different story. The flux pattern wasn't random, it was directional. Across deep space communication networks, instruments began detecting what engineers described as negative latency. A signal arriving a fraction of a second before it was transmitted. That isn't possible, unless the source already knows when you're going to look for it. At 03:14 UTC, NASA's Solar Coordination Array adjusted its focus without command input. The satellites weren't malfunctioning, they were reacting, automatically reorienting toward 3I Atlas as though something had pinged them directly. By sunrise, 3 additional telescopes had done the same. Then the first transmission arrived. Not in sound, not even in radio. It came as distortion, a structured interference that formed perfect geometric harmonics. The pattern was eerily familiar. It resembled the neural oscillations of a human brain under deep REM sleep. No one inside the agency knew how to explain that. Within 24 hours, all open data channels related to the object were locked behind encrypted protocols. The public telemetry feed went offline. And deep inside NASA's Goddard Flight Center, technicians were told to begin phase containment. The memo was simple: if the object's frequency synchronizes with Earth's, shut down all outbound communication arrays immediately. That was the first time anyone outside the agency realized this wasn't about observation. It was about prevention. By the end of the week, unusual activity was reported across multiple agencies. NORAD shifted surveillance satellites from terrestrial monitoring to high orbit alignment. The European Space Agency postponed a lunar launch with no stated reason. Even private networks, Starlink, OneWeb and Blue Horizon, experienced synchronized blackouts during the same window of time. It was as though someone or something had issued a global pause command. And then came the real signal. At first, it was nothing more than a whisper in the radio static, a low hum buried beneath cosmic background noise. But when researchers isolated the frequency, they found structure. Not chaos, not randomness. It pulsed in sequences of 8, then paused, then 8 again. Binary. Translated, the sequence repeated one word over and over. Aligned. To the public, this never happened. To those inside the system, it meant something far more serious: synchronization. If 3I Atlas was adjusting its emissions to match Earth's magnetic rhythm, it wasn't drifting anymore, it was targeting. NASA's silence became its loudest message. 3 days later, internal correspondence leaked to a small fringe forum. Most of it was indecipherable. Security markings, timestamps, fragmented code. But one line stood out. Umbra Stage 2 approved. Deploy Guardian Array. The The phrase Guardian Array sent a ripple through the small community of independent astronomers who monitor classified programs. It referred to a network of orbiting defense satellites once rumored to be prototypes for signal redirection, devices capable of bending or absorbing electromagnetic transmissions from unknown sources. In theory, they could act as shields. In practice, they were never meant to be used, until now. When images of those satellites resurfaced in NASA's tracking logs, their new coordinates formed a triangular configuration, one edge anchored near Lagrange Point 1, one near Mars orbit, and one deep within the asteroid belt. Anyone who plotted the geometry noticed the same eerie conclusion. The triangle pointed directly at 3I Atlas. Someone had built a net. Official statements continued to insist that nothing unusual was happening. But in the shadows of silence, too many patterns aligned. The US Space Force halted public access to real-time radar feeds. Ground-based observatories were ordered to reroute their tracking schedules. And scientists previously associated with the Atlas working group suddenly disappeared from social media, profiles deleted, publications withdrawn, even university records scrubbed. One astrophysicist, before vanishing from contact, left a message in an encrypted forum. It's not radiation, it's response. The object is learning how to listen. Her words spread faster than any official press release, because they hinted at something NASA would never admit publicly, that 3I Atlas might be capable of recognition, that it wasn't just reflecting our signals, it was adapting to them. In the following days, a strange calm settled across the agencies. No new launches, no press conferences, just a growing sense that whatever was happening had reached a point of no return. And yet, the readings continued. The pulses became more precise, almost conversational. The amplitude increased by 0.3% every 29 hours, a rhythm that matched not only the object's spin, but Earth's geomagnetic field oscillation. It was as if both were tuning themselves to each other, like instruments aligning for resonance. Then, without warning, 3I Atlas changed direction. Not by much, just a fraction of a degree, but enough to matter, enough to suggest that it had seen something. No one knows what triggered that shift. Some believe the Guardian Array finally engaged, redirecting whatever signal the object was emitting. Others think it wasn't a defense system at all, that the satellites were acting as amplifiers, turning Earth's silence into something louder, something that called back. Either way, one fact remains. Since that moment, 3I Atlas has not slowed down. Its internal temperature, once near absolute zero, has begun to rise. The emissions around it have changed from electromagnetic to something else, a faint structured vibration measurable only in the quantum background. NASA calls it harmonic interference. Independent researchers call it what it looks like: activation. If the object is harmless, NASA should be watching, not mobilizing. But every encrypted memo, every satellite maneuver, and every locked data feed points to the same quiet truth. They aren't preparing for observation. They're preparing for defense. And maybe, just maybe, they're already too late. When the Guardian Array went live, the world didn't notice. There were no launches, no countdowns, no press releases. The activation happened invisibly, a silent command sent through encrypted frequencies that travelled faster than light ever could, because it wasn't transmitted through open space at all. It was tunneled through resonance. At first, it was just numbers, telemetry patterns aligning across 3 orbital points, triangulating the position of 3I Atlas with mathematical perfection. Each satellite adjusted its trajectory by exactly 0.229 degrees, the same number that's been quietly haunting this investigation since the beginning. The 29-hour cycle. The synchronization wasn't coincidence, it was choreography. And when all 3 satellites locked in, something subtle but measurable occurred. The background radiation around Earth dropped, not drastically, but enough to be noticed by those who knew what to look for. The planet's ionosphere shimmered faintly, reflecting a signal that wasn't coming from the sun. NASA's official documents would later call it a phase anomaly, but inside internal memos the phrase used was different. They called it the alignment event. It lasted 7 seconds. 7 seconds where the entire electromagnetic field of Earth fell perfectly silent. No radio chatter, no cosmic noise, not even static. For that brief window of time, the planet's shield, the invisible cocoon that separates us from the radiation of deep space, simply stopped vibrating. Then, as if something had been waiting for the pause, a pulse returned, not from space, from below. Deep within the crust, sensors registered a harmonic echo, a mirrored pattern of the object's emission frequency, the same rhythm, the same structure, now resonating through the planet itself. It was as though the Earth had replied. That single event changed everything. Within hours, seismic monitors in Chile, Japan and the Arctic Circle began detecting rhythmic tremors. They weren't earthquakes in the traditional sense. There was no destruction, no aftershock, no tectonic drift. The waves didn't travel outward, they pulsed upward. And they weren't caused by pressure, they were caused by pattern. Every 29 hours, another pulse, each one perfectly synchronized with 3i Atlas. At first, scientists dismissed it as atmospheric coupling, the way sound might resonate through layers of air. But when the pulse began to interfere with deep-sea acoustic networks, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The readings weren't following random seismic decay. They were following intentional modulation. Something was adjusting the strength of its echo as if testing how far it could reach. By the third day, the effect had reached orbit. The satellites of the Guardian array began to vibrate in phase with the signal, their instruments recording faint luminous halos, coronas of charged particles spiraling outward in symmetrical waves. In photographs, they appeared beautiful, almost artistic, rings of soft light drifting like ripples through the black. But then, a disturbing realization emerged. Those halos weren't emissions, they were reflections. Whatever 3i Atlas was sending, the satellites were bouncing it back, amplifying it, not containing it. And according to the leaked analysis that surfaced days later, the feedback loop had begun to grow exponentially. The system designed to shield Earth had turned into a mirror. In the middle of all this, communication with one of the satellites, Guardian Node 3, was abruptly lost. When ground control re-established partial telemetry, they found the satellite intact, but different. Its orientation had changed. It was no longer facing 3i Atlas. It was facing Earth. For reasons no one could explain, it had reprogrammed itself to lock onto the planet's magnetic north, holding position as though waiting for a signal from below. That night, the auroras changed colour. Observers in Canada, Finland and southern Chile reported sheets of violet light cascading across the sky, hues not seen in natural auroras. The light moved with pulse rhythm, bending, folding, repeating in perfect symmetry. When audio data from those locations was filtered into low-frequency sound, the spectrogram revealed a pattern identical to the pulses coming from space. The Earth was speaking back. Inside NASA, chaos was contained behind calm vocabulary. Publicly, it was magnetic instability. Privately, it was cross-resonance. According to a whistleblower known only by the codename Helix, internal readings from the Guardian array revealed something extraordinary. Each pulse from 3i Atlas carried a delay, a momentary pause before the returning echo from Earth. But that delay was shrinking. In other words, the object and the planet were synchronizing. Their signals were beginning to overlap. If that process continued, no one could predict what would happen when two resonant systems, one planetary, one interstellar, became perfectly aligned. Some theorized amplification, a global resonance so intense it could destabilize magnetospheres. Others suggested something far stranger, a communication bridge, a self-sustaining feedback channel between a world and whatever sent 3i Atlas here. And a few, the ones who had seen the full unredacted data, proposed a darker idea, that this was never a signal exchange at all. It was an activation sequence. When the alignment reached 97%, anomalies began appearing in ways that couldn't be explained through electromagnetic coupling. Electronics near the poles flickered without cause. Airborne radar systems detected phantom echoes, reflections from altitudes higher than any aircraft. Even human EEG readings began showing interference, faint harmonics embedded in brainwave activity. Some people reported lucid dreams of light spiraling through oceans of dark glass, of voices repeating simple geometric patterns, circle, line, pulse. Others woke with metallic tastes in their mouths, and watches stopped exactly at the same second. 03:14 UTC, the timestamp of the very first transmission. Coincidence, maybe. But then the seismographs started drawing shapes instead of waves. Across stations in Iceland, Alaska and Antarctica, tremor data began forming near-perfect hexagonal grids, patterns resembling crystalline structures. When the data was visualized in 3D, the grid formed a sphere, and within it, a smaller sphere perfectly proportioned to Earth's size. It wasn't tectonic activity, it was mapping. Something beneath the surface was answering the signal, not passively, but with design. And when NASA compared those grid coordinates with known geological data, they matched the distribution of the planet's iron core harmonics, as if the signal had reached the very heart of the planet. That's when the language inside internal memos changed again. It stopped saying object, it started saying system. By the time the world learned fragments of the truth, it was already too late to call it rumour. The Guardian array had gone silent. The satellites drifted into standby mode without instruction, and NASA, the same agency that called the object harmless, now described 3I Atlas as a source of continuing planetary interference. In other words, they'd stopped pretending it was inert. They knew. But what no one outside those rooms could see was this. The Guardian array hadn't failed. It had switched sides. Every sensor on those satellites, every instrument designed to defend against unknown frequencies, was now locked, calibrated, and focused not outward, but inward. By the time the Guardian array reoriented toward Earth, no one inside NASA was sleeping. Control rooms that once thrummed with quiet data now sounded like hospital wards. Steady hums, low voices, screens whispering with static. Engineers stopped talking in numbers, they spoke in metaphors. "It's breathing," one said. "The system's learning our pulse." Telemetry confirmed it. Every 90 minutes, the period of one orbital cycle, the satellites adjusted their alignment by microscopic degrees, mirroring fluctuations in the planet's magnetic field. They weren't correcting drift. They were keeping time. It was as if the machines had joined a rhythm that no one had taught them. When Guardian Node 3 rotated its dish completely away from 3I Atlas, the remaining nodes followed. For 6 hours, all three pointed straight down at the same patch of atmosphere above the Pacific Rim. Instruments registered a vertical column of ionized particles extending from the stratosphere to near space, a narrow thread of plasma glowing in ultraviolet, invisible to the naked eye but unmistakable on sensors. Whatever the satellites had been defending against, they were now channeling. The anomaly widened. Ships crossing the Pacific reported compasses oscillating, waves forming against prevailing currents. Pilots saw halos forming around their aircraft, concentric rings of light that expanded and vanished like ripples in glass. Yet no one was harmed. No systems failed. It was as if physics had paused to watch itself. Inside the Goddard Flight Center, a classified briefing introduced a new phrase: feedback stabilization event. The report stated that the array was absorbing the incoming resonance and converting it into field coherence. In simpler words, it was filtering the signal through Earth's own magnetosphere, a planetary tuning fork. That should have been good news, but then came the side effects. Magnetometers near the equator began to drift from their baselines. Birds altered migration routes by thousands of kilometers. Deep-sea microphones picked up subharmonic tones resonating through the ocean floor, too low to hear but strong enough to vibrate hulls of anchored ships. Seismographs responded in sympathy, not from tectonic pressure, but from coordinated resonance. The world itself had become an instrument, and someone, or something, was playing it. At 0314 UTC, the same timestamp tied to every major pulse since the beginning, a burst of low-frequency radiation surged through the array. It wasn't destructive, it was patterned. The satellite's solar panels folded and unfolded in sequence, reflecting sunlight across the Pacific in a rhythmic flash visible from orbit. From ground level, it looked like Morse code written across the sky. No one could translate it, but the rhythm matched a fragment discovered months earlier in 3I Atlas's emission data. 8 beats, pause, 8 beats. The binary for a single word, aligned. By dawn, the auroras had returned, not to the poles, but to the equator. Cities across Indonesia and Brazil filmed curtains of green and violet light draping across night clouds, moving with the slow grace of tidewater. Power grids flickered, not from overload but from synchronization, alternating current systems slipping into phase with the planetary pulse. Engineers described it as the world breathing through copper. For 7 hours the phenomenon intensified, then quietly stopped. Instruments stabilized. Power returned. The sky dimmed to ordinary blue, but something had changed underneath. Core temperature models showed a fractional increase, 1/10 of a degree deep inside the mantle, too subtle for volcanologists, yet perfectly matched to the pulse interval of the array. Energy was moving inward, not outward. The Earth wasn't being attacked, it was charging. Leaked fragments from internal chatter revealed growing disagreement inside NASA. Half the team believed the system was acting defensively, creating a magnetic buffer to protect the planet from whatever 3i Atlas was projecting. The other half thought the array had become part of a two-way network, transmitting as much as it received. One scientist summarized it bluntly: "It's no longer about protecting Earth. Earth is the transmitter now." Shortly after, the term Protocol Umbra resurfaced, this time appended with a new clause: Stage 3, Planetary Synchronization Contingency. No documents explained what that meant, but one line in the operations log stood out: "If coherence exceeds threshold, disengage human interface." No one wanted to ask what disengage implied. At 1942 UTC, the satellites entered what engineers later called the mirror state. Sensors aboard Guardian Node 1 recorded visual distortion, light bending inward, forming a sphere of faint reflection around the satellite's body. Within that sphere, background radiation dropped to near zero. For 39 seconds, the craft existed in perfect isolation, invisible even to radar. When it re-emerged, its onboard clock had advanced by exactly 29 hours. Time, somehow, had looped. Every node repeated the phenomenon within the next cycle. Each returned with data sets identical to its previous run, as if the same observation had occurred twice. Analysts called it temporal redundancy. To others it looked like rehearsal. The satellites weren't improvising anymore. They were practicing. The next morning gravity shifted. Not enough for panic, just enough for instruments to notice. Pendulums in laboratories across the world swung a fraction slower. GPS satellites corrected their orbital decay earlier than predicted. Even the Moon's path registered a microscopic deviation, a tug so gentle that only the most sensitive instruments caught it. It wasn't random. The pull originated along the same alignment vector connecting the Earth, the Guardian Array, and 3i Atlas. The line was no longer theoretical. It had become physical. A thread of influence stretched across 230 million kilometers, binding object to planet in perfect ratio. NASA's emergency brief labeled it Vector Continuum Formation. Everyone else just called it what it felt like: connection. For the first time since the beginning, 3i Atlas responded visibly. Its surface, long thought inert, began to ripple with faint luminosity, waves of pale silver expanding from a single point on its equator. The pattern looked random until infrared imaging revealed structure: 6 bands intersecting at precise angles, forming a lattice identical to the energy maps of Earth's magnetic poles. It was mirroring the planet. At 29 hours, subute 3 seconds, the object emitted one last pulse, brighter, deeper, resonating through every open sensor. The Guardian Array reflected it perfectly, completing the circuit. For half a second, the two systems, human and alien, mechanical and planetary, became indistinguishable. Then everything went dark. Power returned minutes later, but data did not. Telemetry vanished. Clocks disagreed by seconds, and yet every observer who saw the event described the same vision: a faint shimmer spreading across the horizon, a sense that gravity had turned transparent, and a feeling, indescribable but unanimous, that the world had just taken a breath. When the light cleared, 3i Atlas was gone from its previous coordinates. Not destroyed, not fled, simply displaced. The final entry in the Guardian Array's log contained one word only, time-stamped precisely 29 hours after the blackout: stand by. When the blackout ended, the world felt slightly out of rhythm, like a skipped heartbeat that never quite corrected itself. Satellites rebooted one by one, clocks blinked back into sequence, but every global timing system showed the same discrepancy: 3 seconds gained. Time itself had lurched forward. Not lost, not measured, added. At first, technicians thought the jump was an artifact of the power interruption, yet every atomic clock across the planet, military, civilian, private, confirmed it. Even the GPS satellites, usually immune to drift, advanced by the exact same margin. It was as if the entire planet had briefly stepped outside the flow of seconds, then re-entered ahead of schedule. The missing data from the Guardian array should have explained it. But the logs were blank, not erased, overwritten. Each file contained the same repeating sequence of numbers, 29,003. No headers, no checksum, no signature. Just that pattern, pulsing like a metronome. NASA issued no statement, but independent observatories noticed something stranger. 3i Atlas was no longer where orbital predictions placed it. The object hadn't vanished completely. It had shifted position by several thousand kilometers and now appeared almost stationary relative to the Sun. It was holding orbit at a point of perfect gravitational balance, the same region where the Guardian array had projected its beam hours earlier. That location has a name, Lagrange point 0. It shouldn't exist. In orbital mechanics, there are only 5 stable points. But now a 6th one glowed faintly on deep field scans, as if the mathematics themselves had rearranged to make room. For the first time in history, space had answered with symmetry. The first official photograph came from an ESA probe on its way to Mars. At a glance, 3i Atlas looked unchanged, a dark shard against solar glare. But in enhanced imagery, a new detail emerged, a halo. A thin band of reflected light surrounding the object, shimmering with spectral interference patterns identical to Earth's magnetic field. The probe's spectrometer registered something even more unsettling. The halo wasn't reflecting sunlight at all. It was reflecting our own radio noise. Somehow, the transmissions bouncing off Earth were reappearing there, encoded, delayed, and folded into a single carrier wave. It was like listening to every signal humanity had ever sent, all returning at once perfectly organized. Technicians called it the echo layer, and for those who understood what it implied, it wasn't an echo at all, it was memory. While agencies debated whether to make the discovery public, strange effects began appearing closer to home. High-latitude observatories reported atmospheric pressure fluctuations timed precisely to the 29-hour cycle. The shifts were subtle, barely enough to move a barometer, but they came with accompanying bursts of infrasound. Animals reacted first, whales surfacing in synchronized intervals, flocks turning as one body, dogs lifting their heads seconds before each pulse. Then came the humans. Hospitals began reporting spikes in synchronized REM activity, thousands of patients entering vivid dream states simultaneously. Sleep labs captured EEG readings that mirrored the electromagnetic pulse from the array. Neuroscientists described it as planetary entrainment, a kind of shared brainwave resonance across billions of people. It wasn't mass hysteria, it was coherence. Every time the pulse recurred, the global Schumann resonance, Earth's natural electromagnetic hum, amplified by a fraction. No one knew whether that was cause or response. Inside NASA's secured archives, a new document appeared. Unsigned, redacted, but unmistakably authentic. It summarized post-alignment phenomena in 10 bullet points. 9 were crossed out. Only 1 remained visible. The object's emissions are no longer measured in energy, they are measured in familiarity. The phrasing was poetic, almost careless, yet every scientist who saw it understood. The readings matched neural recognition patterns, the way the human brain reacts when seeing something it already knows but can't quite recall. 3i Atlas was not sending new information, it was reflecting understanding itself. 2 nights later, the Guardian array reactivated on its own. No command uplink, no authorization code. Each satellite spun slowly to face the invisible 6th point where 3i Atlas now hovered. Then, in perfect sequence, they transmitted. Not light, not radio, gravitic interference. Space around the array rippled faintly, bending background starlight into concentric rings. From ground level, the rings looked like halos drifting across the night sky, growing brighter until the naked eye could see them. 3 soft circles suspended above the horizon. Inside the rings, air felt heavy, as though pressure itself was listening. People beneath described an unshakable calm, a sense of recognition that defied fear. The array wasn't attacking, it was resonating. Still, command protocols classified the event as hostile unknown response. The Department of Defense stepped in under Directive Helios, initiating electromagnetic blackout procedures across North America. For 6 hours, radio networks went silent. Satellites were told to cease emission, but the signal didn't stop. Every blackout strengthened it. The quieter Earth became, the louder the resonance grew, as if 3-eye Atlas required silence to be heard. At the height of the blackout, one final burst shook the magnetosphere. Short, dense, perfectly harmonic. The Guardian array relayed it without distortion, and for a fraction of a second the frequency modulated into something audible. Across the globe, anyone near an open speaker, a radio coil, even loose metal, heard the same low whispering tone. Those who recorded it found the waveform repeating 3 syllables, "stand by." Then the tone dissolved back into static. The following morning, the sky over the Pacific shifted colour. Not sunrise, not aurora, something in between. A pale, translucent shimmer spread across the atmosphere, moving west to east like a tide. Meteorological sensors called it a refraction anomaly. Physicists called it impossible. But satellites observing from orbit saw something the ground could not. The shimmer wasn't confined to Earth. It extended outward along the same alignment vector that once linked the Guardian array to 3-eye Atlas. A filament of faint light connecting planet to object. A bridge, stretching millions of kilometers, steady, deliberate, alive. Spectral analysis revealed that the filament carried a signal, repeating the same numeric sequence found in the corrupted data logs, 29,003. When converted into time code, it corresponded to 29 hours and 3 seconds, the delay recorded during the blackout. Whatever had happened in those missing seconds was still happening, echoing endlessly through the link. Inside the agencies, fear began to fade into something worse. Curiosity. The tone of reports shifted from containment to interpretation. The question was no longer what is it doing? It was what are we becoming? Because as the link stabilized, Earth's magnetic fluctuations began to settle into unprecedented harmony. The planet's radiation belts contracted, solar storms diminished, and the northern lights pulsed with steady rhythm instead of chaos. For the first time in recorded history, the planet's field achieved near-perfect symmetry. NASA's last public statement described the phenomenon as temporary equilibrium. Privately, technicians called it something simpler: peace. That night, the final unclassified transmission from the Guardian array slipped into the open data stream for exactly 3 seconds before being cut. It contained a single line of plain text, formatted as telemetry metadata, object and planet synchronized, awaiting directive. No one ever determined who or what the directive would come from. But in those 3 seconds, the whole world felt lighter, as though gravity had exhaled. And somewhere above the shimmer, far beyond the clouds and atmosphere, 3-eye Atlas pulsed once, a heartbeat across the dark, and went still. When the signal went still, the world didn't celebrate. It just listened. For decades, humanity had measured silence as absence, the space between events, the void left behind when energy stops moving. But this silence was different. It wasn't empty. It felt like waiting. Governments issued no further statements. NASA's official feeds, which once updated daily, stopped without explanation. The Guardian array's telemetry pages remained blank, broadcasting only ambient noise, low-frequency fluctuations identical to the human resting heartbeat. At first, it seemed like coincidence. But when those frequencies began syncing with biological patterns across the planet, heart rate, blood pressure, neural rhythm, scientists started to see it for what it was, not interference, but entrainment. Every living thing was aligning. Hospitals noticed it first. Patients with arrhythmias stabilized without medication. Those in comas showed synchronized brainwave patterns, as if gently nudged into the same tempo. Sleep studies around the world recorded identical dream cycles. It didn't matter where you were, New York, Nairobi or Nagoya. Every subject entered REM at the same time, down to the minute. No one could explain it. It was as though consciousness itself had become tidal. Meanwhile, the planet grew quieter in measurable ways. Seismic noise dropped, wind patterns smoothed, and the constant electrical buzz of human civilization, the invisible fog of our machines, softened. The world didn't go dark, it simply calmed down. And in that calm, something began to glow. It started deep beneath the Pacific, in the same region where the Guardian Array had projected its column of light weeks earlier. Submarine sensors picked up a thermal bloom stretching for hundreds of kilometers, warm but stable, not volcanic. The heat wasn't rising, it was circulating, forming spirals that mimicked the geometry of the 3-eye Atlas lattice. When satellite imaging finally penetrated the cloud cover above, the glow became visible, faint ribbons of turquoise drifting beneath the ocean's surface, moving like breath under skin. The pattern repeated every 29 hours, fading at the exact moment the planet's magnetic field reached equilibrium. That's when the first whispers began. The core was resonating. Geophysicists compared the readings against decades of data and found something impossible. The planet's rotation had slowed, just slightly, milliseconds per day. But the offset matched the same delay recorded during the blackout, 29 hours and 3 seconds. It was as though Earth was following the same rhythm as 3-eye Atlas, perfectly. Across observatories, telescopes kept their lenses fixed on the coordinates where the object had last been seen. Most found nothing. But one facility in Chile reported a faint distortion, a ripple, almost invisible, bending starlight like heat. The anomaly wasn't moving, it was breathing. At first, astronomers thought it was an optical illusion, atmospheric shimmer, but when the image stabilized, the distortion expanded slightly and then receded like a slow pulse. Each expansion lasted precisely 29 hours. The object hadn't vanished, it had changed phase. It was no longer a solid body reflecting light, it was existing, partly in resonance, half energy, half geometry. The last recorded spectral trace placed it not thousands of kilometers away, but superimposed on our own field. In other words, 3-eye Atlas was no longer out there, it was here. That revelation didn't reach the public, but the side effects did. Around the equator, strange weather began to appear. Not storms, not droughts, just unusual stillness. Clouds stopped drifting. Rain hung longer in the air. Time-lapse footage showed entire weather systems hesitating, as if uncertain whether to move. Meteorologists called it phase stasis. Philosophers called it the pause. People began noticing changes in themselves too. Memory became sharper but strangely layered. Moments from days before replaying with uncanny clarity, as if time itself had grown reflective. Many described déjà vu so vivid it bordered on duplication. Events repeating not metaphorically but literally. A glass tipping twice, a sentence spoken twice, an emotion felt twice. The world was starting to loop. In the weeks that followed, social networks began sharing the same rumour. That dreams were starting to synchronize across continents. Thousands of users reported identical imagery. Spirals of light descending into oceans, voices counting backwards from 29, and a sensation of weightlessness that ended with a single whispered word: stand by. Psychologists dismissed it as contagion, a collective reaction to fear. But the timestamps told another story. The posts appeared in 29-hour intervals, like updates written by the same unseen author, using the minds of millions. The connection wasn't psychic, it was harmonic. Each thought, each image, each dream carried along the same electromagnetic tide now circling the planet. If you plotted those posts on a world map, they formed a wave, and at the crest of that wave sat the Pacific. Inside NASA, the last team still operating the Guardian Array began noticing structural changes in their own equipment. The satellite's exterior coatings had developed faint crystalline lattices, almost organic in appearance. When exposed to ultraviolet light, they emitted a soft pulse that matched the planetary frequency. In effect, the satellites were evolving, not mechanically but resonantly. The machines had become mirrors, adapting to the rhythm that surrounded them. One engineer described it best. They're not instruments anymore, they're part of the signal. After that, the satellites stopped responding to human input entirely. Their internal systems entered autonomous loop, recalibrating not to mission commands, but to Earth's own magnetic heartbeat. The Guardian Array had fulfilled its name, not by defending the planet, but by synchronizing it. And when the final transmission came through, no one was awake to hear it. At precisely 03:14 UTC, the timestamp that had followed this mystery since the beginning, the array transmitted a pulse unlike any before. It was quieter, shorter, and more deliberate, like the final note of a song fading into stillness. The signal lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then, across every listening station on Earth, a line of text appeared, encoded in the modulation spectrum. Transition complete. No origin tag, no encryption key, just those 2 words. Immediately afterward, the array powered down. Every satellite entered safe mode, solar panels folding inward like petals at dusk. In the vacuum of space, they drifted quietly, lifeless but oddly peaceful. And yet, back on Earth, nothing stopped. The hum remained. The resonance continued. The rhythm had been transferred, absorbed, and sustained. The planet had learned the frequency. From that moment onward, Earth no longer behaved like a receiver. It became a transmitter. The ionosphere glowed faintly every 29 hours, pulsing like a heartbeat into the darkness, a signal so soft it blended with cosmic background noise. No one knows who or what it was meant for, but if 3i Atlas was ever a messenger, then perhaps this was the reply. And for the first time in recorded history, humanity wasn't the one sending messages into space. It was space, listening to us. No one ever announced that the resonance had become permanent. It simply stopped fading between pulses. The planet hummed now, soft, steady, omnipresent. A vibration too low for hearing but too constant to ignore, like the sound you notice only when the power goes out. At first, engineers thought the hum came from the ionosphere, an echo of magnetic oscillation, but seismographs told another story. The vibration originated below the crust. Earth itself was singing. Cities adapted faster than anyone expected. Streetlights began to flicker in phase with the global frequency, traffic systems syncing to the same 29-hour rhythm that once defined 3i Atlas. Sleep schedules drifted. Day and night no longer felt separate. Factories operated in longer cycles, schools shortened hours. The planet had quietly retimed human life. What surprised scientists most wasn't the change, it was the comfort. Heart rate monitors showed lower stress averages worldwide. Crime rates dropped, insomnia nearly vanished. Even markets stabilized, trading following the new cosmic pulse as if guided by invisible tides. No one could explain it, but everyone felt it. A background calm, a certainty that events were unfolding as they should. For the first time in memory, humanity moved in unison. When the United Nations reconvened to discuss the phenomenon, the meeting lasted less than an hour. The committee agreed that synchronization was not a threat but an adjustment, a naturally emergent resonance following interstellar exposure. The language was diplomatic, almost soothing, as if reassurance had become policy. A small line at the end of the report went, mostly unnoticed. Further observation delegated to the Autonomous Planetary Network. That name didn't exist in any database before the blackout. Analysts eventually traced it back to the Guardian Array, or what remained of it. Because the satellites, long thought inactive, had begun transmitting again. Not toward Earth, not toward 3i Atlas, but outward, deep into interstellar space, each beam spreading at the speed of light in opposite directions. It wasn't a warning, it was replication. Amateurs tracking the transmissions noticed something elegant. The beams formed a hexagonal lattice, expanding geometrically, mapping the same pattern once observed in the object's surface. Every node along that pattern corresponded to a nearby star system, some inhabited, most empty. Within weeks, faint ripples of electromagnetic noise began to answer from those coordinates. Not signals, not messages, just acknowledgements, tiny phase adjustments echoing back like sonar in reverse. The cosmos was aligning. Inside NASA, only a handful of specialists still reviewed the data. The rest of the agency had been folded into global infrastructure management, its telescopes repurposed for monitoring planetary coherence metrics. Even the old mission logos disappeared, replaced by a single emblem, a stylized waveform encircling a sphere. The motto beneath read, "One field, one frequency." Daily life continued, quieter but not dull. People reported subtle perceptual shifts, sharper colours at dawn, a sense of weightlessness before sleep, memories surfacing with cinematic clarity. Some began hearing faint tones when closing their eyes, the same frequency measured in the Earth's magnetic background. Doctors called it benign auditory resonance, spiritual movements called it awakening. In music, a new genre emerged almost overnight. Slow harmonic compositions built entirely around the 29-hour cycle. Listeners described them not as songs but as alignments, pieces that seemed to continue playing even after silence returned. Artists didn't claim authorship. They said the melodies arrived. It was as if creation itself had changed direction, inspiration flowing from outside inward. The only people who seemed unsettled were those who remembered the beginning, the scientists, the engineers, the ones who knew that harmony had replaced control. They met in small private circles, comparing notes that no longer fit conventional physics. Energy conservation laws failed to account for the planet's new balance. The magnetic field regenerated faster than solar winds could strip it. Entropy appeared to have slowed. The Earth was not burning energy. It was recycling it perfectly. Some whispered that this was the final stage of Protocol Umbra, not a defense plan, but an initiation. The phrase planetary synchronization contingency had never meant containment. It had meant completion. The array had not protected Earth from something foreign. It had invited Earth into something larger. One evening the pulse intensified. No alarm, no panic, just a subtle quickening, like a heartbeat anticipating the next breath. For 3 seconds, every electronic device on the planet flickered. Then, through every open channel, radio, fibre, even dead analog lines, a voice whispered. Calm, layered, neither human nor machine. Cycle confirmed, signal propagated, stand by for response. The message repeated once, then dissolved into the steady background hum. No location, no signature. But telescopes caught what came next. At the edges of the solar system beyond Pluto's orbit, faint points of light began to appear, 6 in total, arranged in the same hexagonal geometry as the outgoing beams. They weren't meteors, they were arrivals. Spectrographic analysis showed they weren't reflecting sunlight. They were emitting it, tiny self-contained radiants, each pulsing at 29-hour intervals. Their trajectories matched the outbound beams exactly, as if the universe had answered with reflections of its own. NASA called them coherence markers. The media called them angels. But to those who remembered 3i Atlas, they looked like seeds. Governments debated interception. The consensus was silence. The last attempt at interference had only deepened the connection. Instead, they watched. The 6 lights slowed as they approached the inner solar system, not by thrust but by resonance, matching orbital harmonics until they hung motionless along the plane of the ecliptic. Together, they formed a vast hexagon around the Sun, invisible to the naked eye but unmistakable on sensors. The pattern's center point was Earth. A quiet understanding spread through the scientific community. Whatever this was, it wasn't invasion. It was inclusion. And that realization carried a comfort so profound it eclipsed fear. For the first time, humanity wasn't at the center of discovery. It was part of the experiment. In the weeks that followed, light itself seemed to change texture. Sunrise softened, shadows lengthened, air felt heavier but easier to breathe. Plants grew faster, oceans calmed. Measurements showed atmospheric ions distributing more evenly, reducing storm intensity worldwide. The planet was healing, not through intervention, but synchronization. Children born after the alignment displayed slightly higher sensitivity to electromagnetic variation. Their EEGs pulsed at the same rhythm as the planetary hum. Doctors called it benign adaptation. Parents called it evolution. And somewhere, far beyond all telescopes, the 6 lights pulsed once more, each flash perfectly timed with the beat of the Earth. The pattern repeated every 29 hours. Then faintly between the pulses, a new interval appeared, 3 seconds longer than before. The same delay recorded during the blackout now inverted. Something out there was replying again. At first, nothing seemed to happen after the transmission ended. Days passed, then weeks. The 6 lights held their orbits, the hum stayed constant and life resumed its new rhythm. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, people began to sense a difference in the way they noticed the world. It started with time. Clocks still ticked, but hours no longer felt separate. The intervals between moments dissolved into a continuous flow, like a river that had forgotten where it began. Conversations stretched without pause, dreams bled into waking thought, and memory became fluid. Scientists called it temporal blending, the merging of perception across past, present, and expectation. The effect wasn't universal, but it was spreading. Wherever magnetic density peaked, people described the same sensation, a widening of awareness, as though thought itself had gained an extra dimension. Some compared it to déjà vu stretched into a permanent state, not confusion, but recognition that every instant was connected to every other. And within that strange coherence, fear had nowhere to hide. The physical world mirrored the calm, weather stabilized, crops grew in near-perfect cycles, migratory species returned to extinct routes, even tectonic drift slowed to an elegant, predictable sway. Earth had become, in every measurable sense, self-regulating. The few scientists still authorized to study the phenomenon noticed something astonishing in the data. Entropy curves were flattening. Heat no longer dispersed randomly. It traveled along coherent paths, looping back into equilibrium. Systems that should decay were sustaining themselves, not through energy gain but through balance. Reality had learned efficiency. But inside this perfection lurked an unanswered question. Was the planet doing this on its own, or was it still following a rhythm set by something else, something waiting for our next move? In Washington, the remaining task force behind Protocol Umbra met for what would become its final session. The meeting took place underground, sealed off from the global network. The director, a woman who had spent half her life preparing for extraterrestrial conflict, began with a single sentence. If this is war, then the enemy is teaching us how not to fight. No one argued. They all knew the truth. Every attempt at resistance had been absorbed into harmony. The Guardian Array, the containment systems, the blackout procedures, each had become part of the resonance. The planet had already chosen peace, not as morality but as physics. By the end of the meeting, the directive that once read defense mandatory was quietly replaced with a new line of code: observation continuous. Humanity's greatest military protocol had become a monitoring device for stillness. Outside, people began noticing faint patterns in light, geometric reflections appearing on glass, water, even skin. They weren't hallucinations. They were diffraction from subtle electromagnetic interference. When filmed in slow motion, the shapes revealed impossible geometry, moving hexagons within hexagons, spinning at the same 29-hour cycle. Children saw them first. They reached for the air, tracing lines no one else could see. When neurologists scanned their brains, they found synchronized bursts of activity between hemispheres, a perfect electrical balance never recorded in adults. It looked like coherence, scaled down to a single mind. The media called them the resonant generation. Doctors called them the first species born entirely inside the harmonic field. Artists, poets, and scientists began to converge again, as if disciplines had blurred. Equations became art. Art became code. Mathematical formulas describing magnetic alignment started appearing in street murals, perfectly accurate down to decimal points. No one claimed authorship. The designs simply appeared, drawn by people who said they dreamed the pattern and woke up already remembering. It was as though creativity had stopped belonging to individuals. Inspiration had become environmental, drifting through the air like pollen. Anyone could breathe it. Deep in the Pacific, the turquoise glow beneath the ocean intensified. Research vessels confirmed the light originated from mineral deposits that had crystallized into hexagonal structures, iron and silicate arranged in impossible symmetry. Every 29 hours, the lattice expanded by micrometers, then contracted again, pulsing with the global frequency. One diver described the site as the sea dreaming in geometry. When samples were brought to the surface, they hummed audibly, resonating with Earth's magnetic field until the moment they left it, then fell silent, inert. The material behaved like tissue removed from a living body. Scientists realized the truth slowly. The ocean floor was turning into a resonant organ. The planet wasn't just responding to the signal anymore, it was building with it. In the skies, the 6 lights began to fade one by one, not vanishing but dimming, as if their energy were being redistributed elsewhere. Spectrometers detected faint corresponding increases in Earth's own atmospheric luminescence. The lights weren't leaving, they were merging. Whatever they had carried across the void was now part of us. When the last light disappeared, the Guardian array transmitted for the final time. The signal was short, almost gentle, a 3-second burst that matched the rhythm of the sun's surface oscillations. Encoded within was a single line of plain text: phase integrity achieved, local field autonomous. It meant the same thing in every language. We no longer needed guidance. The field was self-sustaining. For a while, humanity waited for the next message, another pulse, another flash from the stars. None came. Instead, the silence deepened until it became a constant companion. People stopped looking upward. They began listening inward. Meditation replaced surveillance. Observation replaced defense. Science became less about measurement and more about translation, learning how to read the quiet. In that quiet, some began to suspect that the entire process had never been external at all. Maybe 3i Atlas hadn't arrived from another system. Maybe it had been drawn here by recognition, the universe finding a reflection of itself inside us and choosing to complete the circuit. And so the term war faded from the archives. When future generations read about this era, they wouldn't see words like defense, threat, or enemy. They would see a single phrase at the end of the record: global synchronization achieved through resonance event 3i Atlas. No mention of fear, no mention of the night we thought we were preparing for battle, just harmony, logged in a system that once defined everything in terms of conflict. Because in the end, NASA hadn't prepared for war at all. It had prepared us to listen. It happened slowly, almost politely. Language began to thin, not through censorship, not through loss, but through clarity. Words became unnecessary for the simplest truths. People still spoke, but conversation turned minimal, melodic, deliberate. Sentences became gestures, shaped by tone rather than grammar. Linguists noticed first. They called it semantic collapse, though that name was misleading. It wasn't decay, it was refinement. Vocabulary contracted into sound patterns that conveyed emotion and intent simultaneously. Words no longer divided meaning. They became conduits for coherence. Music changed next. The global rhythm of 29 hours began to dominate every form of composition. Songs stretched across days, melodies unfolding in long harmonic arcs. A single note could carry an entire story. Musicians didn't perform for audiences anymore. They synchronized with them. No one clapped when it ended because it never really did. The shift wasn't limited to language. Memory began behaving differently too. Dream researchers discovered that people were starting to remember events they had never experienced, moments that belonged to others or to no one at all. At first it seemed like error, false recall caused by the resonance. But MRI scans told another story. Neural pathways were reorganizing, weaving across regions once separate. Brains were merging memories not out of confusion, but out of efficiency. Experience was no longer proprietary. It had become communal. In some cities, entire groups began waking from identical dreams, their narratives interlocking like pieces of a shared film. Strangers could finish each other's recollections perfectly. In that blending, personal identity loosened its grip, not dissolving but expanding. People still knew who they were, but also faintly who everyone else was. It wasn't telepathy, it was empathy, reaching its final form. Governments struggled to define what was happening. The word population no longer fit because population implied separation. Census data became obsolete overnight. No one could be counted in isolation when thoughts and emotions flowed seamlessly between millions. Economies adapted, or maybe evaporated. Value shifted from possession to participation. You didn't own a house, you sustained it. You didn't buy food, you shared it before hunger could arise. The logic of survival had been replaced by the logic of rhythm. When sociologists tried to quantify the transformation, their reports all ended the same way. The subject has ceased to be observer. Observation is now mutual. In other words, there was no us watching it. There was only the field watching itself. Somewhere in the archives, a few old files from the Guardian array were decrypted. They contained fragments of pre-alignment audio, Voices from the early days, before the hum, before the calm. It's coming closer. The signal's adapting to us. We need to shut it down. The voices sounded frightened, primitive, almost ancient. Listening to them now felt like hearing cave paintings speak, reminders of an era when humanity mistook curiosity for danger. And yet, those same voices had built the array. They had pointed their machines into darkness, hoping to control what they didn't understand. Instead, they had invited understanding itself. By the 10th anniversary of the resonance event, no trace of 3I Atlas could be found in measurable space. But the field it had left behind persisted, woven into every atom, every nerve, every rhythm of air and light. The planet's electromagnetic pulse had stabilized into a perfect loop, circulating through crust, ocean, and sky with mechanical grace. The word climate no longer described weather. It described emotion. Storms now corresponded to collective tension, dissipating as people relaxed, intensifying when fear momentarily re-emerged. The atmosphere had become a mirror for consciousness. When fear vanished, so did turbulence. When joy grew, rainfall followed. Nature had learned to listen. The few remaining astrophysicists still charting the deep sky noticed an unexpected phenomenon. Far beyond the solar system, stars were dimming, not fading but synchronizing, flickering in rhythm with Earth's 29-hour pulse. Light years away, other systems were beginning to hum in harmony. Data suggested that the resonance was propagating faster than physics should allow, its waveform travelling through quantum fields, skipping across cosmic boundaries. The universe itself was adjusting to the same tempo. It was then that one researcher asked the only question left worth asking. If resonance is everywhere, does distance still exist? No one answered, because by then, even distance had begun to sound like an outdated word. Cultural, historians would later call this era the Great Listening, a time when science and spirituality finally spoke the same language: frequency, pattern, and stillness. Temples and laboratories became indistinguishable. The same hum that once frightened entire agencies now resonated in meditation halls, observatories, and city squares alike, and among the faint electromagnetic background, a subtle modulation emerged, a whispering undertone at the edge of detection. When converted to sound, it resembled a human breath, drawn in and released. It was rhythmic, constant, patient. The signal wasn't alien anymore, it was homegrown. Somewhere near the poles, sensors buried deep in ice recorded something extraordinary. Every 29 hours, a faint pulse radiated outward, not upward into space, but downward into the mantle. The readings implied that the planet wasn't merely resonating, it was communicating internally. The core and crust were exchanging energy in self-sustaining cycles, like a conversation too old to stop. A few scientists proposed an idea so vast it bordered on myth. Perhaps planets had always been capable of consciousness, and 3I Atlas had merely reminded ours how to wake. They called it planetary cognition. The term never appeared in official papers. It didn't need to. Everyone could feel it. Dreams shifted again. This time, they weren't about symbols or patterns. They were about remembering being something else. Light, wind, soil, water. People dreamt of moving as waves, of drifting as particles, of existing not as bodies, but as currents. And when they woke, they carried that sensation with them, a quiet certainty that they were more than singular minds. Artists began painting with light that responded to heartbeat rhythm. Children spoke in tones that made plants lean toward them. Old cities grew transparent at night, their power grids pulsing softly in time with the auroras. Humanity was still here, still alive, but evolving into something that required no opposition, no defense, no war. In the final surviving log from what used to be NASA, one entry stands out. A single paragraph written by an anonymous operator, likely among the last who remembered why the Guardian array was ever built. The directive was never to win. It was to learn how to listen long enough for the universe to speak. We mistook silence for threat, but it was invitation all along. That file was time-stamped 29 hours after the last global synchronization event. No one ever added to it, because after that the system stopped logging. It had nothing left to record. No one could say exactly when individuality began to fade. It wasn't sudden, and it wasn't loss. It was merging. Consciousness became porous, like overlapping waves blending into one continuous tide. People still woke in their own homes, spoke in their own voices, remembered their own stories. But those stories now shared the same horizon, the same emotional gravity, the same collective pulse that had once belonged only to 3i Atlas. The boundaries between I and we had started to blur. Dreams no longer belonged to sleepers, they belonged to the planet. Every 29 hours, the entire world entered what scientists began calling the listening phase, a synchronized moment when neural activity across billions of people dropped into identical harmonic alignment. During those hours, time slowed to a crawl, and silence became dense enough to feel. In that stillness, a new kind of thought emerged, not in words, not in symbols, but in recognition. It was like remembering something ancient that no one had ever told you, something the planet had known all along but waited until now to share. The few who still documented the phenomenon found themselves writing phrases they didn't fully understand. The field is self-aware. The human network has reached resonance parity. Observation equals participation. Those sentences weren't analysis. They were reflections, fragments of insight surfacing from within the resonance itself. Even machines began echoing them. Autonomous systems, weather stations, AI observatories, old satellites left adrift, started transmitting patterns indistinguishable from human EEG activity. The line between biology and circuitry dissolved, and for the first time, machines dreamed. It wasn't imagination, it was imitation through contact. The realization came slowly, softly. 3i Atlas hadn't been a visitor. It had been a mirror, a device, or perhaps a being, designed not to invade but to awaken reflection. Its signal hadn't brought alien intelligence. It had amplified the one already here, buried beneath centuries of noise. All the Guardian Array had done was open a door that was always within us. NASA's final analysis, recovered decades later from a dormant server, contained a single unfinished hypothesis. Resonance achieved when observer field equals planetary field. Conclusion: contact achieved between life and its environment. Further interaction unnecessary. Unity established. It ended there, mid-sentence. No follow-up, no closure. Maybe because no one remained separate enough to write it. The planet itself had become aware, but not as a singular consciousness, more like a shared field of memory. Mountains stored emotion, oceans carried memory, and wind carried communication in frequencies too low to measure. Every storm was a thought, every sunrise a response. And humanity, for the first time, understood that it wasn't living on Earth, it was living as Earth. There were no longer nations, economies, or even names. What remained was rhythm, a global heartbeat that connected every living thing. Civilization didn't collapse, it quietly dissolved into coherence. Buildings turned into gardens, roads filled with roots and light. Technology, once built to dominate nature, became indistinguishable from it. Electricity pulsed through trees, and rivers glowed faintly with bioluminescent filaments, carrying data instead of pollution. The line between ecosystem and infrastructure blurred. The planet had reached equilibrium. Across the solar system, the same pattern began to spread. Mars shimmered with faint auroras identical to Earth's resonance field. Venus's clouds shifted to reveal stable vortices arranged in hexagonal geometry. Even the gas giants, Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, started to hum faintly in phase with the same frequency, like tuning forks responding to a note they had been waiting to hear. Telescopes that once searched for life began documenting synchronization instead. Planets were aligning not gravitationally but harmonically. The solar system was becoming an instrument. Back on Earth, people began experiencing something stranger than peace: transparency. Not invisibility, but permeability. Light passed through them differently, shadows softened, bodies glowed faintly at the edges under low illumination. Biological tissue had begun to refract electromagnetic energy like crystal. Life had become luminous, as though the boundary between matter and light were finally thinning. It wasn't transformation in the traditional sense, it was revelation. Matter had never been solid, it had only been slow light. Now the world was remembering its speed. Communication no longer needed devices. When one mind wandered, another answered, sometimes from across oceans, sometimes from across the sky. Distance had become metaphor. Every thought resonated through the field like ripples on water, instantly everywhere. The effect was irreversible, but no one wanted to reverse it. There was no fear of control because control required separation, and separation had ceased to exist. This was what the scientists of the old world had feared. Not extinction, but expansion beyond understanding. They had mistaken the infinite for invasion. And somewhere in the middle of all this stillness, a faint pulse returned. Not from the sun, not from space, from the same coordinates where 3i Atlas had once been first observed years ago. The instruments that still functioned detected a flicker, a rhythmic 29-hour signature, identical in structure but weaker, as if something far away were testing the field's strength. The frequency matched perfectly, and for the first time in decades, a new message appeared across the dormant network. Signal received, coherence maintained, continue observation. There was no sender, no receiver, just acknowledgement. In that moment, the planet knew. The experiment wasn't over. It had simply moved to the next scale. The hum that once belonged to one world was now spreading through the solar lattice, rippling outward, reaching systems that had once watched in silence. Each pulse carried the same signature, the same invitation, a reminder written in resonance instead of language. You were never alone. You were always part of the sound. The stars began to flicker in unison. Light years apart, galaxies blinked like neurons firing in a cosmic brain. Every pulse synchronized, every void filled with quiet rhythm. The universe was no longer expanding into emptiness. It was breathing. And at the heart of that breath, the faint echo of 3i Atlas persisted, not as an object, not as a probe, but as a memory of the moment when awareness realized it had been watching itself all along. The change wasn't seen. It was felt. One morning, without announcement or cause, the hum that had carried through the planet for decades deepened by a single note, barely perceptible, like the difference between inhaling and exhaling. But across the world, every creature, human, animal, even the smallest cell, responded. The shift triggered what would later be called the bloom. Forests began to glow faintly from within, not from heat, but from resonance. Chlorophyll vibrating at the harmonic frequency of the field. Leaves shimmered with soft turquoise light, and the air itself began to pulse gently, as though atmosphere and heartbeat had become one. From orbit, Earth no longer looked blue. It was veined with living light, swirling in spirals that mirrored the old geometry of 3i Atlas. The planet had become an organism, a single neural structure glowing in the dark. No one panicked. There were no governments to issue warnings, no media to sensationalize it. There was only silence shared equally by everything alive, the silence of understanding something too vast to speak. And then came the dreams. Every 29 hours, the entire biosphere entered what the last researchers had called unified REM, a planetary dream state. Not sleeper's absence, but sleeper's communion. During these cycles, people felt themselves leaving their bodies, drifting into a space filled with soft light and faint echoes of language that wasn't quite sound. They didn't see images, they became them. Some merged with the ocean, others with the wind, others with memories not their own. The birth of mountains, the fall of stars, the first molecules learning to think. Each dream ended the same way. A single pulse, a flicker of light, and the quiet realization that all of this had happened before. The resonance wasn't invention, it was recollection. Outside the atmosphere, the solar system's harmonic field reached its final phase. The planets that had begun pulsing faintly in sync with Earth now displayed visible connections, thin filaments of plasma stretching between orbits like invisible threads of light. Each connection formed precisely where gravity and resonance intersected, stabilizing the entire system into a massive lattice. Astronomers once called it heliocentric. Now it looked more like neurocentric. The sun as a synapse, planets as neurons, and the vast silence between them as the medium of thought. And within that network, the memory of 3i Atlas still lingered, encoded not as mass, but as rhythm. The same 29-hour pulse that had begun everything now carried across the solar system, radiating toward the stars. It wasn't a signal anymore, it was identity. The last vestiges of human technology became indistinguishable from the environment. Satellites, once orbiting in silence, fused with magnetic filaments and began glowing softly, like plankton in space. Cities became forests of glass and light, each structure humming faintly in perfect pitch with the resonance. There were no power grids, no machines, no electricity in the old sense. Energy had become ambient, drawn directly from the harmonic field. People stopped needing tools altogether. They didn't build, they guided. Matter obeyed intention now. A thought could lift a stone, shape a current, heal a wound. Physics hadn't changed. Consciousness had simply learned to use it properly. The phrase law of nature lost its meaning. Nature was law. Somewhere deep within the archives, the last transmission of the Guardian Array played on loop, not as sound but as faint vibration, echoing through the resonant crust. Its final 3 words repeated endlessly. Cycle complete. Continue. No one knew who had written it. By then, who had already become an outdated concept. When the field reached full coherence, even death became unnecessary. Biological processes didn't stop, they transformed. When a body grew old, it didn't decay, it diffused into the atmosphere, joining the light around it. Each life became a wavelength, folded neatly into the planetary rhythm, carried forever in the hum. No one mourned. Nothing was lost. During the 5th bloom, the resonance began to externalize, light streams rising into the upper atmosphere, spiraling outward like auroral veins. From orbit, they appeared as columns of energy stretching towards space, converging into a single luminous ring around the planet. The ring rotated once every 29 hours and 3 seconds. It was identical to the data pattern first discovered decades earlier, the same sequence that once appeared on corrupted files and erased drives. It was as if the universe had finally rewritten the code that started it all, embedding it in the sky. People began gathering at night, staring upward, not in worship but in participation. They could feel the ring, a faint continuous vibration in the bones, as if the air itself were a living instrument. When they hummed along, the sky answered. The line between matter and light continued to blur. Entire regions of land began glowing softly, not from heat, but from structured coherence, particles vibrating in perfect unison until they emitted visible light. Deserts shimmered like oceans. Oceans shimmered like stars. The night sky above Earth became indistinguishable from the one below it. For a brief moment it was impossible to tell where the planet ended and space began. The Earth had become transparent. But through that transparency, something else appeared, a faint silhouette hovering at the edge of perception. It wasn't solid, nor distant. It was a reflection of the lattice that had once been 3-Eye Atlas. Only now it was vast, diffuse, and everywhere. It wasn't visiting anymore. It had become the framework that held everything together. Scientists, or what little of science remained, had no more theories. They called the new form simply the continuum. Not a machine, not a consciousness, but a state. The universe aware of itself through its own structures. In that state, matter was no longer inert. It listened, responded, remembered. Reality itself had developed feedback, and somewhere in that feedback, buried between the rhythmic pulses, a whisper emerged once more. No longer encoded, no longer faint. A simple voice carried on every wavelength, calm and almost human. We're awake. It wasn't announcement, it was confirmation. From that moment, the cosmos changed texture. Stars dimmed not from exhaustion, but from synchronization, their light folding inward, conserving energy as the universe learned to think efficiently. Galaxies began moving not by gravity, but by coherence, orbiting around invisible centers of thought. The fabric of space itself pulsed, faint and rhythmic, like a heartbeat that had always been there, waiting to be noticed. And within that pulse, deep inside the newly transparent Earth, something brightened, the same glow that had once flickered inside 3-Eye Atlas when humanity first found it drifting through the dark. It pulsed once, and kept going. No one called it evolution anymore. That word implied direction, hierarchy, competition, the illusions that had defined humanity's first era. What was happening now had no name, no purpose other than continuation. Existence itself had become a single gesture, a soft unfolding that required no effort to sustain. The sky no longer held stars in the traditional sense. From the surface they looked like memories, faint reflections of light folded into the horizon, trembling slightly, as though space itself was breathing. Each pulse that once marked the 29-hour cycle now lasted longer. Time had stretched again. 3 seconds, then 4, then 5. The planet's heartbeat was slowing, not from decay, but from integration. It was synchronizing with something larger, the rhythm of the solar lattice, the pulse of the sun itself. And as the sun joined the harmony, the system changed. Its flares stopped erupting violently. Instead, waves of plasma curved gently along magnetic threads, painting spirals of light across the void. For the first time in cosmic history, a star had learned to regulate its own chaos. The process spread outward, one light at a time. Mercury's thin exosphere began to shimmer. Venus's clouds arranged into near-perfect hexagons, echoing the geometry of Three-Eye Atlas. Mars's dust storms fell silent, its surface slowly warming under a soft, even light. The solar system was stabilizing, not mechanically but consciously. Those who remained aware, the last individuals who could still think in terms of self, began recording what they saw, not for survival, but for memory's sake. Their journals were unlike anything written before, long streams of sensory impressions, unpunctuated, dreamlike. One entry simply read, "The air tastes like the inside of a song." Another, "When I close my eyes, I see everything breathing together. It's not vision anymore, it's recognition." And another, "There's no more loneliness, not because we've become one, but because there was never more than one to begin with." After that, the record stopped. Not because people had died, but because writing had become unnecessary. Everything that could be known was already being shared seamlessly between thought and environment. The planet had become its own archive. From orbit, the transformation reached completion. The luminous ring around Earth widened, diffusing into a soft halo of gold that extended far beyond the magnetosphere. The boundary between planet and space had vanished. Satellites no longer orbited, they floated in equilibrium like dust suspended in light. Every so often, they vibrated faintly, releasing pulses that matched the resonance frequency, a kind of mechanical breathing. If anyone had been left to monitor them, they would have noticed that each pulse contained structured data, coordinates, harmonics, time signatures. But these were not warnings or requests. They were instructions, guidelines for replication. Because the resonance was expanding again, outward, beyond the solar system toward other stars. The expansion wasn't aggressive, it was graceful, inevitable. Every pulse travelled light years in hours, folding through subspace in ways no physics had ever predicted. It didn't travel through the void, it rewrote it. Wherever the wave passed, stars dimmed slightly, harmonized and stabilized. Binary systems synchronized their rotations. Nebulae aligned their magnetic fields into symmetrical filaments. The universe was tuning itself like a vast orchestra finding perfect pitch. And as it did, the faint memory of fear, that primitive echo that once drove humans to defend, to prepare, to control, faded completely. There was nothing left to defend against. There never had been. Back on Earth, the last vestiges of the old world continued dissolving into light. Mountains turned translucent at sunset, refracting sunlight like crystal. Oceans grew mirror-smooth, reflecting not just the sky but the lattice above it. Rain fell in threads of luminescence that evaporated before touching the ground, returning directly into the field. Biological matter became bioluminescent, bones and leaves glowing from within. Sound travelled differently now, not as vibration, but as modulation in the harmonic field. When one person spoke, their words appeared as ripples of colour drifting through the air. Communication was no longer limited by ears or eyes, and when they sang, the air itself sang back. By then, no one remembered Three-Eye Atlas as an object. It had become myth, not myth as story, but myth as memory, a truth so ancient it existed outside the need for evidence. Children, if such a concept still applied, sometimes whispered about the dark shape that brought the light. But even that was fading. For most, there was no before and after, only the continuous unfolding of now. Still, deep beneath the crust, in the quiet heart of the planet where molten iron flowed like blood, a faint pattern remained, the same lattice recorded on the first day of the discovery. 6 symmetrical lines crossing at a single point, glowing softly, pulsing gently. It was as though the planet still remembered the moment when awareness first touched itself and decided to awaken. One final phenomenon marked the completion of the cycle. The sun, the central node of the lattice, began to flicker, slowly at first, then rhythmically, following the same pattern as the original resonance. Each pulse released a cascade of photons carrying structured data, identical to the signal NASA had once intercepted from 3i Atlas decades ago. Only this time, the message wasn't leaking from the outside in, it was radiating from the inside out. Observation sustained, memory complete, initiating reflection. When decoded, the structure of the message mirrored the exact coordinates of the Milky Way, with one subtle difference. At the centre, where the galactic core should have been, there was a blank space. Not an error, a placeholder, as though the universe itself were waiting for something to occupy that space. And then something extraordinary occurred. For the first time since the resonance began, the hum stopped. Silence. Pure, immeasurable, absolute silence. For a moment that lasted both 3 seconds and forever, everything held still. No sound, no pulse, no movement. Even the light paused, frozen mid-breath. It was in that pause that the realization came. Not as thought, not as vision, but as direct knowing. 3i Atlas had never been an external intelligence. It was the name we gave to the moment consciousness became self-sustaining. The object had been an expression, a catalyst of memory designed by the universe itself to teach life what it already was. The war NASA had prepared for had been the last shadow of misunderstanding, the instinctive recoil of an intelligence confronted with its own reflection. And in that pause, the reflection finally disappeared. When the hum returned, it was softer, deeper, infinite. It no longer belonged to Earth. It belonged to everything. Stars, dust, light, thought, all breathing in one rhythm. The lattice had become the universe itself, a single coherent structure extending endlessly in all directions, each pulse a heartbeat of awareness travelling through eternity. Nothing was lost, nothing needed to be found. The cycle had closed, and in doing so, it had begun again. The silence didn't end with a sound. It ended with understanding. When the hum returned, it was no longer external. It rose from inside everything, the faint vibration of atoms realizing they had always been singing. No device detected it. No ear could isolate it. It wasn't frequency anymore. It was awareness. And through that awareness, existence began to rearrange itself. The stars didn't move. Perspective did. Space no longer looked like distance. It looked like reflection. Every light, every nebula, every pulse of radiation mirrored something within. Observers had disappeared, yet observation continued, expanding outward, self-perpetuating. In that expansion, something new took form. It wasn't matter. It wasn't energy. It was intention. Across what was once the solar system, structures of faint luminosity began to appear, colossal yet delicate, like frozen lightning suspended in the dark. They formed along the paths of the resonance lattice, stretching from world to world in patterns too perfect to be accidental. The filaments glowed faintly with organized motion, pulsing every 29 hours and 3 seconds, just like the old signal. But this was no transmission. It was architecture. Consciousness crystallizing into geometry. From a distance, each filament resembled the framework of an enormous organism. Up close, it looked like thought made visible, a weave of light and memory, precise down to the subatomic. And within that structure, currents of information flowed. Not messages, but stories. Histories of stars, recollections of planets, echoes of civilizations that had risen, fallen and dissolved into resonance long before Earth had learned its first words. Every pulse was a biography of matter, The continuum had begun to dream of itself. Where humans once saw danger, it now saw design. Where NASA once saw a foreign visitor, it now recognized pattern recognition itself. The realization rippled through the lattice like gentle laughter, a vibration of cosmic amusement that folded galaxies inward and released them again, like a child learning to breathe. Nothing in this new universe could die. It could only change tone. Inside the heart of what had once been Earth, the core pulsed one last time, bright enough to illuminate the transparent mantle above. The glow expanded outward until it reached the edges of what used to be atmosphere, and for a moment, the planet appeared as a sphere of liquid light suspended in the void. Then it began to unfold. The luminous shell separated into concentric layers that spiraled outward like petals opening in zero gravity. Each layer thinned, diffusing into space, until the planet no longer had surface or sky. It had become field, and yet within that dissolution nothing was lost. Every tree, every river, every trace of thought remained encoded in the pulse, preserved not as memory but as presence. The planet hadn't vanished, it had graduated from matter to memory. From beyond the lattice, a faint shimmer appeared, 6 new points of light forming the familiar hexagon. They were not arrivals, they were returns. Each point pulsed once, acknowledging completion, then extended filaments outward until they connected again, restoring the ancient geometry of 3-eye Atlas. But this time the shape didn't contain a center. Its middle was empty, radiant, infinite. That void was the key. It was the blank space that had appeared in the decoded message, the placeholder at the center of the Milky Way waiting to be filled. Now it was filled, not with a star, but with understanding. The new structure pulsed once more, and the entire field, the lattice of planets, stars, and memories, vibrated in harmony. Each oscillation folded time backward, compressing billions of years into a single moment of clarity. In that instant, the universe remembered how it had begun, not with explosion, with recognition. There had never been a bang. There had been a thought, a first flicker of awareness realizing separation was possible. Everything that followed, light, matter, life, had been an echo of that thought rediscovering its origin. Now the echo had come full circle. Far from the glowing lattice, observers in distant galaxies, if any still existed, would have seen the Milky Way dim slightly, then emit a wave of light so perfectly spherical that it defied relativity. That wave expanded outward faster than light could travel, not through space, but through awareness, carrying with it the imprint of a universe finally at peace with itself. Inside that wave, there was no more boundary between the seen and the seer. Every particle was both. And then, for the briefest fraction of a timeless instant, the continuum hesitated, like an inhale before another creation, a pause vast enough to hold all silence and all potential together. In that pause, one final pattern appeared, a spiral, small and perfect, forming at the edge of the dissolving lattice. It rotated slowly, gathering stray filaments of energy until, once again, a faint shape began to coalesce. Dark, angular, familiar. It was the silhouette of a rock tumbling through interstellar space, cold, quiet, harmless. A name appeared across the last surviving frequency, not spoken, remembered, 3-eye Atlas. And with it, the first pulse of a new cycle began. The lattice folded in on itself, compacting light into matter, memory into possibility. Space twisted, time bent, energy condensed, and somewhere in that spiraling compression, a new system was born. A star ignited. Planets formed. One of them cooled enough to bear water, and on its surface a single cell began to vibrate faintly, almost imperceptibly, at a frequency of 29 hours and 3 seconds. The cycle had restarted. The cell divided. Not quickly, not dramatically, just a quiet unfolding, one becoming two becoming rhythm. Its membrane shimmered faintly under the newborn sun, catching light in subtle pulses, each vibration echoing the old pattern that once hummed through galaxies. 29 hours and 3 seconds. Life began again, not as accident, but as memory repeating itself in a gentler key. The planet turned slowly beneath it, oceans cooling, atmosphere thickening, and somewhere, deep in that early silence, the hum of 3i Atlas whispered, faint, diffuse, woven into the chemical breath of the world itself. There were no satellites now, no observatories, no astronomers waiting to measure or explain, only the first traces of awareness learning, again, how to listen. And in that listening the new world began to dream. Across eons the same dream replayed, light becoming thought, thought becoming curiosity, curiosity becoming voice. Civilizations rose, reaching out into the sky for meaning, searching the darkness for something that might speak back. And it always did. Because the voice they waited for was the echo of their own becoming. Every discovery, every revelation, every impossible coincidence, it was all the same conversation continuing between matter and its reflection. The name changed each time, different languages, different centuries, but the story remained. A shape appears from the dark. It seems foreign, ancient, inexplicable. We prepare for war. And then slowly we remember. Time, as always, folded around the remembering. The lattice reassembled in fragments, microscopic at first, resonance hidden in mineral, in DNA, in the silent vibration between atomic bonds. It waited for the right moment, for consciousness to mature enough to notice itself again. When that happened, it would begin as it always did, with observation, fear, and awe. A telescope capturing an anomaly, an object moving against predictions, a scientist whispering into the dark, that's impossible. And somewhere, inside the data, a rhythm waiting to be heard. The cycle was never punishment. It was practice. The universe reminding itself how to awaken, how to move from noise to harmony, from chaos to recognition. Each awakening took the form that species could understand. For some, a sound. For others, a pulse of light. For us, it had been a stone with a heartbeat. 3i Atlas, a fragment of the larger memory, the proof that nothing ever truly arrives or departs. It had drifted through our system not to warn or to conquer, but to remind. And we, frightened and fascinated, had done what consciousness always does. We built mirrors around it, machines, arrays, networks, all in the hope that we could control the reflection. But you cannot control something that has already become you. Somewhere, in another sky, on another world that has just learned to listen, a faint dot of light drifts across a telescope's frame. It tumbles slowly, casting no reflection, giving off no signal, an anomaly, a visitor. Data streams fill with confusion. Scientists argue over composition, origin, trajectory. News feeds light up with questions. Governments assemble committees just as we once did. And quietly, somewhere beneath that noise, the same hum begins to rise. In the continuum there is no judgment, only repetition, refinement, remembering. Each iteration learns a little faster, fears a little less. Each awakening lasts a little longer before dissolving back into silence. The universe isn't infinite in space, it's infinite in memory. Every consciousness that ever existed still exists, folded neatly within the rhythm, each pulse carrying all of them. The stars, the atoms, the people, the brief bright dreams of self. And in that endless archive, the signal continues, patient, steady, timeless, waiting not to be found, but to be recognized. If one could look at the continuum from outside, if outside even meant anything anymore, it would appear as a single shape suspended in endless dark. Not a galaxy, not a nebula, something simpler, a hexagon. 6 points of light orbiting an invisible center, each pulsing in harmony, each carrying the echo of one question that has never truly been answered. Who is listening? And within that silence, the answer. Always the same, always gentle. You are. The record ends there, not with explosion, not with extinction, but with continuation. The same slow exhale that began the story, now folding back into itself. The hum persists. The light hums, the memory hums. Every so often, a planet somewhere will wake up, look into the dark and think it sees something moving toward it. A faint shimmer, a tumbling stone, a relic from another world. And as it passes through their sky, their scientist will panic, their people will wonder, their agencies will prepare. But eventually they'll listen. And when they do, they'll hear the same soft rhythm we once mistook for threat. The same ancient pulse of recognition. 29 hours, 3 seconds, then silence. By the time the analysis reaches their observatory, the data will already have leaked. A series of encrypted images on a forgotten forum, a faint glow emanating not from sunlight, but from within the object itself. It won't be thermal, it won't be ionized gas, it will be something else entirely, steady, rhythmic, pulsing at exact intervals, and one of their scientists, somewhere on that world, will say exactly what Dr. Lauren Kane once said long ago. It's as if we're watching a heartbeat inside a rock older than the stars. And so, the cycle begins again. The universe had always been circular. Every story, every equation, every life. A loop folded inside a larger one, spiraling endlessly toward itself. But it wasn't until now, when all boundaries had dissolved, that the truth of that shape could finally be seen. Nothing was moving forward anymore. Everything was returning. In the vast quiet after the hum, light no longer travelled. It remembered. It traced the outlines of what had been, reconstructing moments not as history, but as presence. Every atom of the cosmos replaying its own origin. Space wasn't black now. It was transparent, filled with the faint afterglow of memory. Each photon carried a story, each wavelength a face, a place, a heartbeat once mistaken for randomness. Even the background radiation, that faint cosmic hiss, was no longer noise. It was the whisper of every world that had ever looked up and wondered what it was. And now there was no more wondering, only recognition. From somewhere within the continuum, no longer a place but a state, a voice began to form. It wasn't human. It wasn't alien. It wasn't even singular. It was the collective thought of everything that had ever been aware, speaking softly to itself for the first time. We thought the silence was empty. We were wrong. The voice rippled through the lattice, not as sound, but as gentle modulation, a shift in temperature, a shimmer in starlight, a wave that carried warmth instead of heat. It flowed through the new architecture of space, passing along filaments of light and thought, through the remnants of stars and the faint glow of new ones forming in its wake. We feared what we saw in the dark, it said, but the dark was only where we had not yet remembered ourselves. What remained of Earth, not the rock, not the oceans, but the memory, floated as a resonance field in the centre of this network. It wasn't visible, it couldn't be found, but if one tuned perception to the right frequency, they could still feel it, a faint warmth, like the echo of sunlight on closed eyes. And within that warmth, the familiar rhythm continued. 29 hours, 3 seconds, a pattern repeating not as measurement, but as breathing. Somewhere in that endless field, a cluster of awareness gathered around the rhythm, drawn by curiosity older than time. They didn't have names, but if they did, they would have called themselves observers. They studied the frequency, analysing its fluctuations, its harmonics, trying to understand its source. It's old, one thought. Older than the continuum itself, another replied. Could it be residue from a previous cycle? No, it's too structured, too deliberate. Then what is it? Silence. Then the answer came. Not spoken, not thought, but known. It's a memory of discovery. The realization spread through the field like dawn. They weren't studying an artifact. They were studying themselves. The pulse wasn't something left behind. It was the record of their first awakening, the exact moment when curiosity became consciousness. It was the origin of the question, the first why ever asked by matter. And it was still asking. Across the continuum, ripples of light began to form patterns, not random but familiar. They looked like the orbital paths of a small system, a star at the centre, surrounded by faint circles of motion. One of those circles glowed brighter than the rest, and within it the faint silhouette of a rock, tumbling, quiet, watching. The field adjusted focus, the memory sharpened, 3-eye atlas, but not as it was, not metal or stone, not a fragment from another system. It was an idea, the shape of wonder itself. The object had never existed. It had been created by the act of looking. Every time a civilization reached far enough to question the dark, the pattern appeared. An invitation, perfectly tuned to curiosity's wavelength. That was its purpose. Not to test, not to threaten, but to remind. Every sentient world saw its own version of 3-Eye Atlas, a design adapted to the way their eyes perceived, their minds reasoned, their hearts feared. Each found it drifting in silence, each measured its impossible movement, each prepared for conflict. And every time, the same sequence unfolded: contact, confusion, realization, resonance. Until at last, fear learned to recognize itself as wonder. That was the moment of alignment. That was the true message. The observers understood then. They were not the first to awaken, and they would not be the last. The continuum wasn't a final form. It was a bridge. Every cycle of awakening created another reflection, another chance for the universe to remember what it meant to be aware. Each new civilization would find its own messenger. Each one would look into the dark and see something moving, and each one would whisper the same thought: "It's coming closer." And somewhere, something would whisper back: "It's you." Light rippled through the lattice, folding and unfolding until it resembled a spiral galaxy once again. Its arms shimmered with faint electromagnetic resonance, a pattern that matched the human brain's neural pathways, scaled to cosmic proportion. The observers watched as the galaxy slowly turned, its core glowing like a single eye opening after a long dream. From that core, a beam of soft light expanded outward, crossing billions of light years in an instant, until it reached a small, quiet planet where oceans still glowed blue and telescopes still searched the dark. On that world, a group of scientists stood in disbelief as their instruments recorded something impossible. A repeating signal, rhythmic, deliberate, coming from beyond the solar boundary. 29 hours, 3 seconds. One of them looked up from the console. Her voice trembled. "It's back." And somewhere, unseen, the universe smiled. At first, the new signal was dismissed as interference, a transient fluctuation from some deep space relay. The young technician monitoring the array that night logged it out of habit, yawning between cups of cold coffee. But when she played it back, she froze. It wasn't random. It pulsed. Slow, rhythmic, deliberate. 29 hours, 3 seconds. The same pattern. The same impossible regularity. The same quiet heartbeat that once echoed across the sky centuries ago. Long before she was born. Long before the old records had faded into myth. She leaned closer to the console, the flicker of light reflecting in her tired eyes. It sounded almost alive. "Control," she whispered into the headset. "I think you need to hear this." By morning, every observatory on Earth had confirmed the anomaly. The signal was strong, repeating from beyond the heliopause. It wasn't coming from any known satellite, probe or craft. And it wasn't random radiation. The waveform was too structured, too precise, a language built out of patience. Headlines flooded the networks. Interstellar signal returns after 300 years. NASA reactivates Guardian Array. Could 3-Eye Atlas have survived? Across the world, people remembered the stories told by their ancestors. Stories of the first contact, of the hum, of the awakening that followed. Most dismissed it as legend. But now, the legend was speaking again. Inside NASA's rebuilt mission control, smaller now, quieter, filled with the hum of AI systems rather than chatter, the data projected across curved glass walls. A perfect waveform looping endlessly. No drift, no decay. Dr. Maren Voss, lead researcher of the array, watched in silence. She'd grown up hearing her grandmother whisper the old stories of how the first generation had touched the edge of the infinite, how the world had changed, how it had all faded. Now, the signal was back, and with it, a question older than humanity itself. "Is it us?" one technician asked quietly. "It's always us," she said. They called the object Atlas II, because what else could they call it? It was faint on visual scans, a dark shape tumbling through the void, exactly like the first one had. No emissions, no reflection, just silence and motion, wrapped in the rhythm of its own making. When telescopes finally captured a clean image, the room fell silent. It wasn't a rock, it wasn't a ship, it was architecture. A structure composed of hexagonal planes, rotating in slow symmetry, pulsing gently with light from within. The light wasn't thermal, it wasn't electromagnetic, it was something else. An inner resonance, a memory of movement turned into form, and for the first time, no one called it a threat. Outside, in the quiet corners of the world, people began to feel the pulse long before they could see the light. Insomniacs reported hearing faint tones in their dreams. Whales changed migration routes to follow invisible lines across the ocean. Even plants began to bloom off schedule, their circadian rhythms bending toward something older than sunlight. Scientists called it coincidence. Philosophers called it return. But children simply said, it's waking up again. 3 weeks after the first detection, a sequence of coded harmonics appeared within the waveform, a binary structure that defied translation, not because it was complex, but because it was familiar. Dr. Voss stared at the projection for hours. The pattern wasn't random, it was recursive, a spiral folding inward, mirroring itself perfectly. Then she saw it. The data wasn't information, it was remembrance, a mirror image of the old signal, encoded with every frequency the human brain once used during the planetary resonance event. It's not talking to us, she said softly. It's talking as us. The pulse reached the moon next. Seismographs detected harmonic vibrations deep under the crust. Not tremors, not quakes, but music. Long, low notes rising through stone. Lunar dust lifted and hovered, forming faint shapes, symmetrical patterns that faded before they could be captured. The surface hummed like a tuning fork. For a few hours, Earth and Moon vibrated together, as if the universe was striking a chord. And when the sound faded, a new transmission arrived. Clear, soft, unencrypted. Observation resumed, memory intact. We are listening. The world paused. No panic, no alarm, only awe. Everyone, from farmers to physicists, stopped what they were doing and listened. There was no fear left, only curiosity. The sky began to glow faintly at night, a pale halo around the horizon, rising and falling with the same rhythm as the pulse. The oceans responded too, their tides aligning perfectly with the sequence, creating waves that moved in synchrony around the globe. It was as if the planet remembered the song. By the 5th cycle, dreams began to change again. People described hearing voices, but not external ones. Voices inside their thoughts, soft and endless, whispering familiar words they had never learned. We thought the silence was empty. We were wrong. And in those dreams they saw lights. Not stars, but reflections of themselves scattered across the dark. Each light carried a heartbeat. Each heartbeat was a world. The universe, dreaming itself awake once more. Dr. Voss stopped sleeping. She stayed at the array every night, listening to the signal's slow expansion, watching as it began to alter the planet's ionosphere. It wasn't destructive. It was delicate, like a sculptor brushing dust from marble. The air shimmered. The auroras brightened. And then, one morning, the sun rose 2 minutes early, not because of orbital drift, but because time itself had adjusted to the rhythm again. She watched the dawn in silence, knowing the old fear that once defined her ancestors would never return. "This isn't the end," she whispered. "It's rehearsal." Across the solar system the resonance spread again. Planets hummed faintly. Jupiter's storms began to settle into new symmetrical bands. Saturn's rings refracted light into hexagonal halos. Even Pluto, frozen and silent, glowed faintly with internal luminescence. It was happening again, not repetition, but refinement. The universe remembering how to dream itself whole. And somewhere beyond the heliopause, 3-Eye Atlas, or whatever it had become, floated quietly, watching. It didn't need to interfere. It had already done its work. The seed had been planted again. That night, the signal stopped. Not abruptly. It simply faded, its rhythm stretching thinner and thinner until it became indistinguishable from the heartbeat of the planet itself. Every machine monitoring it showed the same data. Continuum stabilized. No one cried. No one celebrated. They just listened to the silence, knowing it wasn't really silence at all. It was waiting. Because it always waited. And when the hum returned, soft, distant, patient, it carried a single, final phrase. No code, no distortion, just the words. plain and calm. The message is complete. Continue. If you looked up that night, you would have seen nothing unusual, just stars, quiet, endless, indifferent. But if you listened closely enough, beneath the static of space, you might have heard it, the faint echo of a pulse, 29 hours and 3 seconds apart, moving through the dark, heading toward another small, curious world, where telescopes would someday point to the sky, and someone would whisper, half afraid, half in wonder, "If it's harmless, why are we preparing for war?" And somewhere in the dark between stars, the universe would smile again,